Section H, Suffering until Suffrage. So there were about 4 million American men who headed off to Europe during World War I. And in their place, a lot of women stood. So a lot of women took the jobs that these 4 million men had left. And it was interesting because we see the war really causing some sort of a division within the suffrage movement, within the women's movement. There's a minority of women suffragists who were definitely pacifists. They were against war. They did not support World War I. Most notably, there was an organization of pacifist women called the National Women's Party, and this was held or led by a Quaker. Quakers, just so you know, typically very much against war. So a Quaker led this National Women's Party, and her name was Alice Paul. The National Women's Party, to protest World War I, they would have marches, they'd have hunger strikes, that sort of thing. But they were really the minority. The majority of women definitely supported the war. The National American Women's Suffrage Association was also definitely a supporter of the war. And their idea is that, they needed to take a part in winning the war if they wanted to take a part of shaping the peace. They also thought, they were fighting this war for democracy, so if they could fight this war for democracy abroad, perhaps they could get a truer democracy at home. And eventually, they won over Wilson. We'll see Wilson starts supporting women's suffrage. He gives this very famous speech where he says, the women's vote is almost, is vitally necessary war measure, saying that, the women are a huge part of this war cause, stepping up into factories, helping us out the best they can. The least we can do is allow them the right to vote. So in 1917, we start seeing some large states allow women to vote. For example, New York, Michigan, Oklahoma. 1918, we see a lot of European countries opening up the vote for women. Great Britain, Germany, Austria, Hungary. 1918, all of those allowed women to vote. So finally, in 1919, the 19th Amendment is passed, right? That's an easy one to remember. 1919, 19th Amendment is passed, allowing women to vote. All right, and we see almost right away women, take up some of their aims. We see a new act passed that was really passed, appealing to women voters, and that was called the Shepherd-Towner Maternity Act of 1921, which was federally funded instruction in maternal and infant health care. So we can see almost immediately women have the right to vote. So now we see new laws appealing to women voters getting passed right away. Also, we see Congress create the Women's Bureau to protect women's workers. Yeah, and we see they're working towards a lot of things like we've mentioned before, to protect women in the workplace, to prohibit child labor, that sort of thing. Okay, Section I, Foraging a War Economy. So, when we're creating a war economy, what we're meaning is we're trying to shift, our average everyday economy into one that's going to help the war effort out as much as possible. And at first, we really see that we're relying on voluntary actions. We don't pass a whole lot of laws at first, but eventually we'll pass more and more laws as time goes on. So the best example of a administration that really relies on volunteers is the Food Administration. Okay, the Food Administration is charged with one, reducing Americans' consumption of food, and two, increasing America's production of food so we can send as much as possible overseas to help out the Allied cause. And the head of the Food Administration is Herbert Hoover. Of course, Herbert Hoover will become president, but during World War I, he's in charge of the Food Administration. He had, on his own accord, before he was appointed as the head of the Food Administration, has successfully led a massive charitable drive to help feed this poor, war-ravaged country of Belgium. So he had kind of gained popularity through this Food drive he created, so now he's the head of the war, or head of the Food Administration. And like I mentioned, he really preferred voluntary actions instead of, federally mandated regulations. For example, a lot of countries in Europe during World War I had ration cards. So every American had a little card that said how much flour, how much sugar, how much, whatever they got every week, every month, that sort of thing. Herbert Hoover's like, no, we're not going to make this mandated, regulated. We're going to do things like this. We're going to have meatless Mondays. We're going to have, let me just make sure I'm not telling you wrong here. Wheatless Wednesdays, meatless Tuesdays. He encouraged people to grow victory gardens or gardens in their backyards or empty lots, vegetable gardens, just to help out the war. They even encouraged small kids to eat the apple to the core, even being patriotic to the core. They had posters. They had just all this propaganda trying to get people to reduce the amount of food they ate, or to really look at that, and also to produce things like victory gardens, that sort of thing. And this voluntary basis, this voluntary idea, was super duper successful. We see farm production increase about 25%, and the amount of food we're sending overseas increases by 300%, or it triples. So this is very, very good policy. And we see other administrations kind of take hold of some of these ideas Hoover had. For example, we have the Fuel Administration create heatless Mondays to save fuel, lightless nights, gasless Sundays, that sort of thing. So think of this is very much a voluntary thing, but it's definitely very helpful. We even see this kind of voluntary idea being used by the Treasury Department. Remember, the Treasury Department, they have to finance this war. This is very, very expensive. But what they do first is they try to sell bonds. So if you buy a bond, it's like you're kind of giving the American government a loan. You'll get the money back with a little interest, but the idea here is sell as many war bonds as possible to help fund the war. And we'll actually see about 2/3 of the cost of World War I for Americans is actually raised through the selling of these war bonds, or Liberty loans, whatever you'd like to call them. Just kind of a couple side note things here. There was definitely peer pressure when it came to buying bonds. It was the American thing to do. And this was especially noticed if you were a German immigrant or had German heritage. Because if you were German and you didn't buy a war bond, that made you very suspect, so to speak. So we actually see some Germans across the United States who do not buy war bonds being tarred and feathered, being persecuted in other ways. They would, throw yellow paint all over your house, things to that nature. So just so you know, there was definitely some peer pressure going on in America when it came to buying these war bonds. But like I said, it only covered about 2/3 of the cost of the war. So yes, the United States actually did have to increase taxes during this time. Other things to note, not all of the war efforts were voluntary. We had some official policies, right? We had the War Industries Board, which, had production quotas saying you had to build this many ships, you had to produce this many, small arms, whatever it may be. There were some official quotas in place, that sort of thing. The United States more or less took control of the railroads to make them run as efficiently as possible during World War I. And even the idea of daylight savings that we still see around today, that started during World War I. The idea was that you could then extend the workday and also save on fuel because it'd be lighter later in the day. So daylight savings started during World War I, and we've still kept it to this very day. All right. One more thing I do want to mention here. Why not throw it in here? When we're talking about the Food Administration, right, Herbert Hoover, definitely a voluntary thing. One thing that they really wanted to push is that you couldn't use foodstuffs to produce alcohol. So you couldn't use wheat, barley, anything like that to produce alcohol, right? And definitely during this food administratives, like, there's definitely this self-denial, self-sacrifice idea going on. And we really see that kind of stem or lead into prohibition, right? I can't forget to mention this. In next chapter, we'll talk about this more. But in 1919, the 18th Amendment is passed, which prohibits all alcoholic drinks. We should just mention that in this chapter, just so you know, but we'll talk about that later on. So during Wilson's administration, we actually see 4 different amendments passed, right? We had the 16th Amendment, which had income tax. 17th Amendment said that senators were elected by popular vote. 18th Amendment then was prohibition. 19th Amendment, women's right to vote. So just making it very clear, a lot of amendments are passed during Wilson's tenure, or Wilson's term. Okay, section J, making plowboys into doughboys. Plowboys being farmers, doughboys being soldiers. As a side note, doughboys is kind of like the nicknames we gave to soldiers during World War I and even a little bit before. Today we might call them GIs, something like that. So it's just a nickname. And the origin is, there's different stories of how the term doughboy came about. But one of the most popular ones was during the Mexican-American War. American soldiers were, walking a lot in this really white, dusty, chalky dirt. And all of this dirt kind of just covered them from head to toe. So it looked like they had been just doused in flour. So people started to call them doughboys because they looked like a walking, dough, so to speak. So that name, starting during the Mexican-American War, calling soldiers doughboys, just kind of stuck. So when you hear your book when you read in your book doughboys, you're just talking a nickname for American soldiers, nonetheless. Okay, so at first when America declared war, we weren't really dreaming of even sending a huge, batch of American troops over to Europe. We were assuming, yes, we're going to use the Navy to help, keep freedom of the seas alive and well. We're going to ship war materials to allies. We're definitely going to give them loans. But the idea of sending over a whole lot of troops was really not even on the radar. However, in April and May of 1917, it becomes very clear that the Allies were not just short on money, they were short on manpower. So now America has to raise, train, transport an army, and that is a ginormous undertaking, to say the least. And the only good way to raise an army quickly is actually through conscription, right? The draft. So this is, we haven't had a draft in America since the Civil War, since 1863. And even during the Civil War, we had, draft riots, specifically in New York City. So now that we're calling the draft, the conscription back again, people were afraid that we would see rioting. However, that was not the case. Okay, so this time round, the draft's a little bit different. The draft is any males between the ages of 18 through 45, but there was no hiring of substitutes during this time round, right? You couldn't purchase an exemption. There was no draft dodgers. Okay, there were some draft dodgers, but if you were drafted, that was it. You couldn't pay somebody to take your place. Although there were some exemptions, there were, like if you're in a key industry like a shipbuilder, they wouldn't draft you because they thought you'd be more important, building ships. So when registration day came, when the day to sign up for the draft came, it went surprisingly very smoothly. There was definitely a lot more patriotic fervor than there was rioting, to say the least. So America grew into an army of 4 million soldiers. There were also some women who were admitted to the armed forces. We had 11,000 in the Navy and about 269 to the Marines. Also, African Americans definitely served in World War I. However, they were segregated, typically under white leadership, and they weren't typically given combat positions. They would, you know, be on a construction crew or maybe unloading ships, that sort of thing. Some of them did see action, but for the most part, African Americans, you know, it was kind of a racist idea, but they weren't really sure, do we really want to train black guys to fight? They thought, nah, that's probably a bad idea. So they kept them in these non-combative roles. That's how you say that word. Okay, Section K, fighting in France belatedly. Okay, so let's talk about belatedly. The deal was that it took a while to, you know, raise an army, to train an army, and to transport an army across the seas. So it took about a year between the time we actually declared war to actually sending soldiers over. It took about a year to do that. So there's a lot of war being fought while we're trying to raise our army. Something else to know is, of course, we talked about in the last video that in 1918 there's this huge revolution in Russia, right? The Bolshevik Revolution. And they're kicking out their leader, their czar. They actually killed the czar's family. And now they have this kind of communist group in power. You know, Vladimir Lenin's in charge, this communist group. And the communists saw World War I as really a capitalist war. So we'll see Russia just kind of stop fighting. They're going to pull out of World War I. So we kind of see in the void left when the Russians leave, Americans will step in. Because remember, Russians were in the Allied forces. Russia was on our side, right? Russia was on the side with Great Britain, right? So we kind of take the place of the soldiers that are leaving when Russia pulls out of World War I. Okay. And so when American soldiers get overseas, we're typically fighting with the French, fighting with the British, right? We're fighting kind of alongside the Allied powers. We're not typically having our own little army. We're fighting alongside the others. We fought mostly in France, but also Belgium, Italy, and a little bit of Russia. There was something called the Archangel Expedition, where there was actually American troops that were sent into Russia to ensure that all of those supplies, military weapons Russia had, wouldn't find their way into German hands. So there's that, right? So we actually went to Russia to prevent their weapons from coming into German hands. That was called the Archangel Expedition. Praise the Lord. Section L, America helps hammer the Hun. Okay. So remember that really we're talking about the Central Powers, we're talking about Germany, we're talking about Austria-Hungary. They were really fighting a two-front war, okay? So they're in the center, okay? They're the cream and the Oreo, sort of speak. So on the Eastern Front, they were fighting the Russians, okay? On the Western Front, they were fighting in France. So we had a two-front war. The Eastern Front fighting the Russians, the Western Front fighting the French. So now that Russia's like, hey, we're communists, we don't want to fight in this war anymore, we see a lot of the German troops who are fighting in the Eastern Front against Russia leave the Eastern Front and start heading towards the Western Front. So now the Western Front, the fighting picks up like it's nobody's business. We see this kind of huge surge of German troops kind of surging as far as they can through the line in the west, headed towards Paris. They actually, this huge surge of Germans make it almost into Paris. They're only 40 miles away from Paris. If they had captured Paris, France would have fallen, and it would have been just Britain and America left. So they were getting real close to Paris. So American troops, this is when we start to step in. At Chateau Thierry, that's a fun word, Chateau Thierry, Americans, about 30,000 American troops are pulled in there, and we start fighting to stop this German advance towards Paris. Okay, so we're fighting the Germans, keeping them from advancing, And then then at the Second Battle of the Marne, that's where we actually start kicking the Germans' butts a little bit more. The Second Battle of the Marne, we start reversing the German advance. So we start kicking them closer or pushing them out of France. Okay, does that make sense? So the Germans, with all their soldiers from the Eastern Front, gathering with the soldiers from the Western Front, start advancing through France, trying to get to Paris. American soldiers are sent in at Chateau Thierry. And then at the Second Battle of the Marne, then we can finally start, that's when we finally start the force of pushing the Germans out of France. Glory. Okay. Yes. Okay. Yep. Okay. I'm paying attention. Okay. So, like I mentioned, at first Americans were really fighting alongside the British, fighting alongside the French. But after a while, we're like, no, we want to have our own army. We want to just be an American army. We don't want to just be fighting with the French, with the British. We want to be, a force to be reckoned with. So because of that, we were kind of assigned 85 miles of the front to kind of control, trying to cover. And that's led by General John Pershing, right? The guy from Mexico. Remember that guy? General John Pershing is now assigned to protect this 85 miles of front. And really in our second huge battle we have during World War I, this battle's name is Meuse Argonne, okay? Meuse Argonne Offensive. It starts in September of 1918 and will last till the war actually ends in November of the same year. So the idea here in Meuse Argonne, we want to go into Germany and kind of cut or take control of the railroad lines that are kind of supplying German soldiers. So this is the biggest battle American troops had ever seen in history. It's 47 days, 1.2 million American soldiers. And there's some intense fighting, specifically in the Argonne Forest. We see about 120,000 American casualties. Right, remembering the definition of casualties does not necessarily mean people who die, but casualties is the people who die plus the people who are injured. So we see about 10% of our troops are injured or killed in the Argonne Forest. So it's definitely some intense fighting, very slow progress. We're using some very not so awesome battle techniques, like open field tactics, I should say. So we're like literally charging into just this line of machine guns. Typically not a good idea, but we're not super well trained, that sort of thing. So just some fierce battles, fierce fighting in Meuse Argonne offense. Also, there's a war hero. Why not mention a war hero when we have the opportunity? This guy's from Tennessee. His name is Alvin York. He single-handedly kills 20 German soldiers and captures 132 more. Okay, but the idea here is, once Americans join the war, we kind of represent just this endless supply of Americans who will just come and replace, it just felt to the Germans like kind of the last straw. They had fought for 4 years, and here American troops are now just coming in fresh-faced, eager to fight within the last 2 months of this 4-year war. And this really, really discouraged Germans. We see a lot of Germans towards the end of this war just deserting. They're just losing hope. Also, Wilson has a lot of propaganda. He kind of distributes might not be the right word, but distributes leaflets to the Germans, telling them, it's about time to surrender, kind of promising them a peace under Wilson's 14 points, and really, just trying to get them to give up the fight. Okay, section M, the 14 disarm Germany. Of course, talking about the 14 points here. So, Germany facing imminent defeat, they're ready to give up. So they turned to Wilson in October of 1918, kind of seeking a peace based off his 14 points. And Wilson, however, made it clear that they're not going to sign an armistice, right? An armistice is what actually stops the fighting. They're not going to sign this armistice until the Kaiser is gone. Okay, that's kind of the last step. We're like, we don't know. You need to get rid of your Kaiser before we even talk about peace terms. So the Kaiser flees, I should say, to Holland, and he won't be killed. He actually spends the last 23 years of his life in Holland. So now the Kaiser is gone, an armistice is signed, and World War I ends at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. So that means 11 o'clock on November 11th. So even, right after this armistice, it's called Armistice Day, November 11th. And then that turns into Veterans Day after World War II. So even today we celebrate Veterans Day on November 11th because that was the day the armistice was signed, stopping the fighting in World War I. And people say it was really kind of eerie because at 11 o'clock the guns stopped firing all along the Western Front. And it was just really a devastating war. I mean, 20 million people were killed. Another, let me see my numbers here. I shouldn't say 20 million. Wow, that was wrong. Praise the Lord. 9 million were killed. Another 20 million severely injured. So 9 million killed. If you want to see the chart to see, how many Russians, how many Americans were killed, you can look on page 760 in your book. But yeah, so 9 million killed, 20 million severely wounded. Out of those killed, we have about 53,000 Americans. And something kind of like also as a side note, something that's happening in 1918 through 1919 is the Spanish influenza, this kind of worldwide outbreak of the flu. And this will actually kill about 30 million people. So when we say 9 million are killed during World War I, that's horrible, that's tragic. But also 1918, 1919, 30 million people, and that's a conservatively low number, are killed to this new this outbreak of the flu. And we actually see about 10 times more Americans killed by the flu than anyone in World War I. We see about 550,000 Americans killed by the flu. And the flu was interesting because what it did is this strand of flu actually causes an overreaction of the body's immune system. So a lot of people who died from the flu were actually young and healthy. People who would naturally have good immune systems, when they're struck with the flu, it's kind of like the body was attacking themselves, like the immune system was attacking the person. So it was really the young who were killed by this flu. Okay, children and the elderly typically survived a bit, but it was usually the young and healthy who were actually killed by the flu. Oh, praise the Lord. Okay. Let's keep going. So this section really just ends by kind of reinforcing the idea that America helped win World War I, not because of our military, not because of all of these victories, but because we gave them loans, because we supplied food, because we gave them troops at the end when they really needed the extra, oomph and encouragement, that sort of thing. We really only participated in 2 battles. One of which, right, the Meuse Argonne, we didn't actually win that battle. We were still grinding out a victory in that battle when the war ended. So it's really not the victories that were super important during World War I, is what we supplied with the Allies. Okay, last section for this video, section N. Wilson steps down from Olympus. Okay, all right, Mount Olympus, Greek history, kind of like the mountain of the gods. So now we really see, let's just talk about it. Anyway, so the expectations of Wilson were crazy, crazy high. Now that the war had ended, everyone's looking to Wilson as kind of the savior. What are you going to do, Wilson? And expectations extremely high. Thinking of all that propaganda, kind of just boosting Wilson up there. And the idea is, he fumbled it. Kind of like, I don't know any sports analogies, but think of a famous, really well-talented sports player just kind of dropping a pass in the Super Bowl or something. He fumbles it. And here's the idea. During the war in the United States, fighting between political parties was kind of put on the back burner. The idea was, politics is adjourned during the war. We can't have fighting between political parties. We need to be united. We need to focus on the war. However, it is Wilson himself who actually breaks that truce, because he starts campaigning for the Democrat congressman in November 1918 elections. So the elections in 1918, these were midterm elections. These are elections not for the president, for the Congress. And we see Wilson actually campaigning, hoping to get a majority of Democrats in Congress. Okay, but this campaigning backfires, and we actually see in the midterm election of 1918 that actually Republicans gain the majority in Congress, slightly, but still in the majority. So when, Wilson is going to Paris for peace talks, he's the only really leader there that doesn't have control of the legislature back home. So that's not very wonderful. And also a couple things to note. Remember, of course, Wilson's a Democrat. The Republicans don't like Wilson for a number of reasons, especially in this circumstance with these peace talks. One, even the fact that he's going in person really says something, because this is the first president to actually go to Europe during his presidency. And they think this is kind of grandstanding or kind of bragging or really kind of too much, so to speak. Really kind of seeing this as, like I said, bragging. And also another thing that Wilson does, or I should say doesn't do, is in this, when he's putting together his peace delegation, the people who are going to go with him to these peace talks, he does not select a single Republican senator to go with him. And you have to keep in mind that the Senate, to enter into a treaty, it's not really the president who gets to do that. It's the Senate. So the Senate's really seeing the president as overstepping his bounds. This should be, when it comes to treaties, it should be the Senate. Notably, one of the senators that doesn't get to go along is a Republican. And this is the guy who's actually the chair of the Republican committee, or the chair of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. So you would think the chair of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations ought to go to peace talks, but he's not invited to go by Wilson. And this guy, his name is Henry Cabot Lodge, and he'll become important later on. That's why we're mentioning him here. So Henry Cabot Lodge, he had his PhD from Harvard, like I said, the chair of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. He and Wilson are kind of like, just don't get along. Because before Wilson came along, it was Henry Cabot Lodge who was known as kind of the scholarly politician. But once Wilson came along, Wilson kind of stole his spotlight, kind of stole the title of being the scholar politician. So the two really had bad blood between each other. So this will actually come to kind of bite Wilson in the butt later on. Because the thing is, you're the president, you're going to these peace talks. You have to keep in mind the Senate's the one who's going to have to approve any of these negotiations or any of these treaties that come out of these peace talks. So the Senate's super ticked off already. So it's super unlikely, highly unlikely, the Senate's going to sign off of anything Wilson brings back, just kind of in spite. Okay. With that, we're just going to stop this video. One more video left for this chapter.